All right, folks, good morning. Well, it is 7:40, so we're going to go ahead and get started here. A couple of things. I received some emails. I think that they were from probably folks in third period, but a couple of people failed to take the test in the window. And so if you did not take the test, rather than just punishing you with a 0, I reopened it. This is only for people who haven't taken it. There'll still be a time limit, and so on. But this is, that's why it's important to stay on top of things and get what you need to get done. Don't want to have to do that again in the future, so just be mindful. Couple other things here. Let's see. The exam, I haven't gone over the results for the exam yet, but I will get those done within the coming days. Usually takes me a few days to grade them, and I can't really grade them until everybody's taken it. So just be aware of that, but probably by around Wednesday or so, I'll have them graded. Wednesday, Thursday, somewhere in that neighborhood. I've got a busy few days until then. So just be patient with that. The tests will get added. The other thing complicating things is, of course, I have other responsibilities to other classes, and then I have family visiting in from out of town right now, and so that's, obviously a place where I have to devote some time. So just be patient, but things will be updated and continue to move forward. We're now moving into a new unit, okay? So we are we've done 2 units now. We did, the first unit was Late Middle Ages and the Renaissance. And then we did Unit 2, which was the Protestant Reformation and religious wars surrounding Protestantism and Catholicism in Europe. And now we're moving to a new unit, Unit 3, which is on the age of discovery, the age of exploration, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. Unit 3, just to give you a heads up, it's probably going to move by pretty quickly for you. I forgot to do this until just this morning. I forgot that I did not post the reading assignment over the weekend, but hopefully you had a nice restful weekend where you didn't have to worry about homework for Euro or anything like that, and you'll still have plenty of time to get the reading guide done and so on this week. But just understand that it is a shorter unit, and 2, it's kind of a straightforward one. There's not a whole lot of it's not a particularly difficult unit in terms of the content. We're just basically talking about early European exploration out to the New World, right? And to this point, Europeans had really largely been unaware that there was even this other side of the planet with this entirely new continent, 2 continents on it. And so we say that Columbus discovered it, but we're saying on behalf of Europeans he discovered it. Obviously, it was already discovered to the people who already lived here, but Europeans were unaware until Columbus that there was this, this giant landmass on the other side of the ocean. We'll talk a little bit about how Europeans come about to end up exploring the ocean in the first place. And I've already uploaded the new PowerPoint for this unit, which is in the lecture PowerPoints folder on Canvas, so that is accessible to you as we go through today. I'm going to try and keep my voice down. I have to conserve my voice, which I've noticed lately has become more and more irritated from lecturing for hours and hours and hours, so I'm going to try and keep my voice down. My inclination, by force of habit, I'm used to speaking very, very loudly for the class, and even when I'm sitting here lecturing to an empty room, I find myself talking as though I had a group of 40 students in front of me, so I'm going to try and keep my voice down so I can preserve it for longer. Anyhow, so if there aren't any other questions, by the way, can I just get a quick good morning in the chat, see who's in here? You guys haven't said anything yet this morning, so I figured I would get you to say something. Excellent. Very good. All right. Good morning to all of you. Thank you so much. All right. That's fantastic. It's good to see you all this morning, and happy to have you here on a beautiful Monday morning. All right. So, without further ado, let us switch over to my desktop here. Let me close some of these other applications. And we will open up APO. Let's go to this one. And we'll move this over here so I can still see it. Good morning to everyone. Okie dokie. So, new unit, Unit 3, Age of Exploration, the Rise of the Atlantic Economy, Early State-Making and Constitutionalism in England. Okay, so continuing on some previous learnings here, folks, to talk just about a few different things. All right, number one, remember that in this class we kind of have to sometimes jump between locations, and then sometimes too we have to kind of jump back a little bit in history and cover a different avenue of history. Okay, so in other words, I want you to just consider for a second here, okay, consider for a moment that our first unit, we started in about the year 1350. All right, I'll say that again. Consider for a moment that we started our first unit in about the year 1350, and it brought us all the way up to the start of the 1500s, okay? We then went back and talked about it through a different lens of history. So the first lens of history that we used in this class to examine history was kind of an intellectual historical lens. We looked at the Renaissance. We looked at the development and the rebirth of Greco-Roman styles of art, architecture, literature, and so on and so forth. We talked about, we talked about the social dynamic too of what Europe was like back in the 1400s, and there was a lot of that term historical discourse where I was trying to kind of bring you back in a time machine to an earlier era, and get you to understand how people's lives were lived in this time. We talked about some other things too, the plague, the Black Plague, and other things like that, right? Then, for Unit 2, we jumped ahead to the 1500s, all right, and talked largely about the 1500s, where we were looking at an era of the Protestant Reformation, all right, where we see Martin Luther break away from the church. We talked about Calvinism. We talked about the spread of this across Europe. We talked about a number of different wars that took place as a byproduct of the religious pluralism that had developed in Europe. Okay, now we're going back again, but this time, instead of looking at it through a religious lens, intellectual lens, or social lens, now we're going to be looking at things through a bit more of an economic lens. There will be a little bit of intellectual lens as well, in terms of looking at like the Persia categories, right? If that's how we're thinking about these units, okay, we've kind of covered the I in Persia, we've kind of covered the R in Persia, even to some degree the S, but now we're going to be looking at the E in Persia, and and talking a little bit more about the politics as well, politics, economics of European states, okay, who are starting to centralize at this time. We talked a bit about that in Unit 1, particularly England, France, and Spain are beginning to centralize their states at this time. And now we're going to be talking about the economic situation that develops and kind of how the economy works and how the economy was different back in those days than it is today. As well as talking about Europeans who went over to the New World with the expectation of finding gold, and really they weren't originally trying to get to the New World. They were trying to get to India, the Far East. And we'll talk about how all of this develops. Talk a little bit about some technological advancements, particularly from the Portuguese, which are then quickly adopted by the Spanish. But just as a heads up to you, the reason I'm taking some time to introduce this unit today is because, I just want to make you aware that we're kind of going to be going back again to the 1400s. So think of this as happening kind of concurrently with the Renaissance, for example. Okay, so it's all happening roughly right about the same time as the Renaissance, and then as we move into the 1500s, the 16th century, it will be happening alongside the Protestant Reformation. So the stuff that you've already learned about is still going on while we're talking about this. It's almost like if we're watching Star Wars and we've already seen what happened on the Death Star, and now we're going over and seeing what's happening on, the planet, whatever, Hoth, okay, and it's happening concurrently, okay. So think of it kind of like in those terms. All right, new technologies from the age of exploration. Remember that the Renaissance inspired Europeans to begin developing new technologies based on understandings about math and so on that they had been rediscovering from being, exposed to the ancient Greco-Roman traditions for the first time in some number of years, good number of years, a couple thousand years almost. All right, and so so some of the new instruments that come out of this age of learning of the Renaissance would be like the astrolabe, the mariner's compass, the sextant. Each of these are going to be tools that are used by European navigators to measure the positioning of stars, okay, because in a pre-scientific revolution time, okay, in a pre-modern technology time, the only thing that Europeans have, okay, to measure the position of where they're at on Earth is these old school sailors' instruments, okay, that largely no one would really use in modern day times because we have GPS and other modern technology and stuff. But the only way that people were really able to locate their position anywhere close to where their position was on Earth's surface was to measure the movement of the stars relative to one another and relative to the horizon, okay, to get an idea of where they were on Earth's surface. So that's what these technologies do. In particular, they allow you to to know your latitude, all right? That is how north or south you are from the equator. Longitude became more difficult to measure. It took a while before we were able to measure west and east distance on Earth's surface from, say, the prime meridian, which runs through Greenwich, England. Okay, so the measuring that's done by something called a chronometer. Okay, but the chronometer doesn't get invented by John Harrison until nearly a century after all of this stuff. So just be aware that they were able to tell easier in the early days how far north or south they were of the equator, but not quite how far west or east they were. All right. Also, new maps. Frau Moro map, which is on the background here, was considered the greatest circular planisphere map of medieval cartography, even better than Ptolemy's maps. And Ptolemy was that ancient Greek philosopher who had calculated Earth's circumference to within about 98 or so % accuracy. So even, here's the thing, I think a lot of people think that for whatever reason, that when Columbus set sail across the ocean, he was halfway concerned that he would just sail off the edge of the Earth, and that's not really accurate. Everybody on Earth knew that the Earth was round. They didn't necessarily know exactly how big the Earth was. Now, if you take a look at this map here, you can see just how little Europeans know about the shape of, say, so if you look here, this is Europe, and I know it's kind of hard to see, all right, but this is Europe in the background here. You can see England, you can see Spain down here, Italy down over here. This is the Mediterranean Sea. But as you move further south, here's Africa. But as you go further and further south in Africa, they knew there was a lot of territory down here, but they didn't quite have it figured out how much territory there was. Okay, and then over here, Asia, they knew that Europe was huge and that there was a bunch of land that extended all the way over to the east here, but they didn't know, that there was this whole other grouping of land on the other side of the planet. And so, if you really examine this map, it gives you an idea of just how limited Europeans' knowledge was of cartography, of Earth's surface, and so on. Portolan charts were navigational maps based on compass directions and estimated distances between places, and they started using these to navigate the ocean. Then, too, you had these things called chip logs or pit logs, and these measured the speed of your ship using a line of rope tied in knots, a weighted line. They would throw this weight into the water, and as it would create drag, the line would pull out from your hand, and you'd count the number at a certain rate, okay? And over, let's say they would count over 25, 30 seconds, how many knots went through your hand at a known distance from one another. This gave them a rough estimation of how quickly the ship was moving. And indeed, to this day, if you travel on a cruise or on any other ship, they measure their speed in knots as a product of this ancient, not ancient, but archaic technology. Caravels. They started designing new ships at this time. Caravels are small, maneuverable, but seaworthy ships, and they usually had 2 to 3 masts, and they were used by both the Spanish and the Portuguese. In particular, the Portuguese are the ones who really invented it. Now, the reason that these caravels were really important to European navigation is because they featured something called a Latine sail, and if you look in the background image here, it's this triangular shaped sail, okay, right here. That's the Latine sail. And what the Latine sail does is it allows you to sail into the wind by redirecting the wind behind the masts and allow you to catch wind to move your ship in the proper direction. Keep in mind, these ships don't have engines or anything like that on them. They are very much at the whim of the ocean currents and of the wind. Think of it almost like think of traveling on the ocean at this time as kind of like, I don't know if you ever played the game BioShock Infinity, but in BioShock Infinity, or BioShock Infinite, I'm not really sure which one it was, but anyway, in BioShock, there are these like rails that you kind of like use this hook to grab onto, and the rails kind of just take you where they take you depending on what direction you jump onto them. And that's kind of how the oceans work at this time. The ocean, they can't just go wherever they want to on the ocean. There are certain paths of navigation that these folks had to take across the ocean, and the ship was kind of taken by these various trade winds that would change direction as the year goes on, and the jet stream and stuff like that, which also change direction depending on what time of year it is. All right, so these are the ways that they're getting across the ocean. So it became very important to be able to have sail technology that allowed them to harness the wind better. They were stronger built as well. Okay, they had something called clinker-built hulls. All right. and large rudders to steer the ship. Okay, so these ships were very ocean worthy. All right, and prior to this, you have to understand that really the Europeans had not mastered the open seas. The Mediterranean Sea they were able to effectively trade on, but the oceans were another matter altogether. And part of that was because the technology in an earlier era just didn't exist yet. Okay, so it was too difficult for them to be able to traverse the ocean and get across the ocean because the ships were not good enough to be able to do so. There's kind of three important Portuguese men of the exploration era to remember. The first one is Henry the Navigator. Henry the Navigator was the Prince of Portugal, and Henry the Navigator set up a school for navigation at Sagra. And, here's the thing about Henry the Navigator. To be honest with you, Henry the Navigator really is the first European prince to initiate in the African slave trade. Not by design. It's not that he intended originally to go to Africa. The story is more complicated than that. So Henry the Navigator had heard in Africa of the stories of a wealthy king by the name of Mansa Musa. Okay, Mansa Musa was alleged to have vast stores of gold. Okay, and so Henry the Navigator, in setting up the school for navigation and as well as pioneering new Portuguese sailing technologies, sent out an expedition, an exploration mission for these ships, these Portuguese ships, to go down and sail along, hugging the coast, okay, hugging the coast, not sail across the ocean, but going south from Europe, hugging the coast, to go down to Africa, where it was alleged that this great African king from kind of West Central Africa area had, a lot of gold and potentially even, information about trade lines. Now, when the Portuguese go down there, they originally ask about, trading for gold and other things like that, but to their disappointment, there wasn't quite the amount of gold that they thought that there was going to be. And the other thing that they're looking for is they're looking for information for trade routes over to the Far East. They thought that this might be a way of circumventing the Middle East. See, the thing about Portugal, if we look at a map of Europe real quick here, okay, I just want to talk about why Portugal. Of all the places, why Portugal? Let's take a look at a map of Europe. In fact, we'll just use Google Earth because that's easier. Okay, so... All right, so as we take a look here, all right, I just want to call your attention to a couple of things, okay? So here's Europe, all right? Here's a modern-day map of Europe, and here's where Portugal is, okay? It is about as far away from everywhere else in Europe as you can get, all right? It's all the way down over here on the southwest Iberian Peninsula. And why is that important? Well, there's a few things to keep in mind about this. Number one, there's a giant mountain range right here called the Pyrenees Mountains, okay, which is a natural physical barrier between Spain and France. And actually, if we zoom in there, there's actually another independent country right here called Andorra, okay? That's a tiny little mountain country. But anyhow, Portugal is situated all the way over here. Also, keep in mind, Portugal, if we zoom the map out, look at how tiny Portugal is. Okay, Portugal's much smaller than Italy, France, UK, even Spain. And it's obviously much smaller than the continent of Africa, okay? Also, if we take a look at Portugal and Spain comparative to, say, the size of the United States, Mexico, South America, we're talking about much bigger geographical territories over in these regions over here. Africa alone is basically twice the size of the United States. It's just barely not quite twice the size of the United States. All right, so we're talking about huge, vast territories, and there are people down here, okay? And by the way, this is Mali. This is the region from which Mansa Musa originated, okay? And as the Portuguese start to make their way down here, they run into a number of relatively never-before-seen tribes, okay? Because remember that although Europeans had been interacting with Africa for a long time, it was mostly limited to northern Africa, all right? Here's where Turkey is, modern-day Turkey. If we're looking geographically, this entire region over here, Turkey, modern-day Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, places like that, all of this, and then down over into North Africa, and even prior to Ferdinand and Isabella's Reconquista that we learned about before, where they expelled the Jews and the Muslims from southern Spain. Southern Spain was controlled by a group of Muslims known as the Moors, the Moorish people, Moors, okay? And the Moors lived in the southern part of Spain down here for some time, all right? So the Portuguese Catholic, the Spanish Catholic, the French Catholic, we're living in a time before the Protestant Reformation has broken out over here in Saxony, okay? And so, we're still living in a Catholic Europe. Indeed, the Catholics had a whole lot of conflict with the Muslims who lived down in these regions here, all right? And as a product of their religious differences and the number of wars that had been fought, it became very difficult the further west you were in Europe here, okay? If I zoom in a little bit more, it became very difficult the further west you were here to find ways to trade, because Portugal doesn't even have a coast that meets with the Mediterranean Sea. At least Spain has a pretty decent sized coast to trade with in the Mediterranean. That said, Italy dominated that trade, right, with the Ottoman Empire, and so Spain even is not as well positioned either. Plus, with all of the problems that Spain had with the Moorish people and the Muslims in North Africa, they didn't have a very good track record with the Ottoman Empire, which existed across all of these territories here. And so it became very difficult on the Iberian Peninsula to engage in intercontinental trade between Europe, the Middle East over here, and then even further over to here, the Far East, India, Southeast Asia, China, etc. Okay, it became very, very difficult to trade in these regions. But one of the reasons that Europeans in particular, all right, are so interested in trading with the Far East is because there are special goods and products that are only available in these regions. For example, fine silks, okay, certain dyes. Also, looking for spices, okay. European food, due to the limited, climate of Europe, particularly the further north you go, the more difficult it becomes to grow. European food was characteristically quite bland. And food, particularly for wealthy populations, was one of those things you wanted it to taste good. And the only way to do that is to introduce spices and other things like that, many of which do not grow in Europe. And so trade with India and the Far East was very important, but you have this entire region smack dab in the middle between Europe and the Far East that is going to be blocking off both by way of physical barriers, because you're traveling through rugged terrain. There's a number of different mountain regions, including the Pyrenees, including the Alps, including, as we move further over into the Middle East, the Caucasus Mountains and other things like that as we move further and further over. All right, and this is going to pose challenges to European trade, particularly for those folks situated here on the Iberian Peninsula. So initially, Portugal decides to develop their naval capacity so that they're able to move south right here, like I said, hugging the coast, okay, staying along the coast here of Africa. They come into a number of different, these are the Canary Islands over here, all right? They continue to move down and make their way. And as the Portuguese are making their way down, they kind of get here and they realize, well, these folks don't have any gold to trade, all right? These folks don't have any gold to trade. And so what do you have to trade? And basically they're like, well, we've got some slaves we can trade to you. Here's the deal with that. Keep in mind that slavery as an institution continued to exist in Africa, in a time later than slavery existed in Europe. Now, in Europe, they have serfdom, which is not that much better than slavery. It's more or less pretty similar, all right? But the kind of slavery that we're talking about is different. The kind of slavery that existed in Africa was a very limited form of slavery, meaning that when people were slaves in Africa pre-European contact, okay, pre-European contact, slaves in Africa typically didn't remain slaves their whole lives. They would be able to enter into and out of slavery. And certainly there was no generational aspect to slavery. That is to say that slaves in Africa, just by way of having kids, it's not like their kids automatically became slaves. Also, the kind of labor that they're performing is different. The slavery that was going on in Africa tended to be much more limited in scope. They're not farming massive plantations as they start to in the era of the 1500s. Okay, in a pre-European Africa, the kind of labor that they're performing is probably mostly domestic type labor or local subsistence style farming, helping out whoever owned the land or whoever they had been indebted in service into. And then they would do their term, they'd be done with their slave term, and then they would re-enter and no longer be slaves. All right? So I just want to clarify to you that, as slavery progresses as a system, it becomes more and more and more brutal. And I mean that in a number of different ways. Not only the treatment of the slaves, but also the work that they're performing, also the length of their servitude becomes lifelong and generational and starts to pass down to new generations. But these are all of European design in the post-Columbian era, post-Columbus, that is, all right? And so Henry the Navigator is the first European prince to be introduced to slaves acquired from the African coast. And they bring back, I don't know, somewhere in the area of about 10 to 20 slaves. And they're brought back actually to Portugal, all right, initially. And then it's after that, a few years after that, that the Portuguese deliberately start sending ships down to the African coast to acquire slaves. All right, so that's really the introduction to slavery. Bartholomew Diaz is another major important Portuguese guy to understand or remember. He's the first to sail to the Cape of Good Hope, the very southern tip of Africa. So once again, going back over to our map over here, all the way down here, you can see the Cape of Good Hope down here. Okay, and this is as we move all the way down to the southern coast of Africa, and then even afterwards, the Portuguese continue to sail across, up over into what becomes the Indian Ocean, okay? And they come over into the Indian Ocean. They even make certain trading outposts in Madagascar and all the way up into India down the line. But it takes them a while to get there. It doesn't happen overnight because these ships are sailing relatively slowly. And remember, too, that the Portuguese are not going to Africa with the intent of establishing colonies and taking over all these regions. They're going down there to establish trade ties with the people along the coast. And as the coastal Africans continue to start trading with the Europeans, of course, they're acquiring European manufactured goods. So in a relatively short time, the coastal communities of Africa, they could be kingdoms, they could be tribes, they could be kind of somewhere in between, all right? But these communities of coastal Africans in this region in particular, all right, this is what we call Senegambia, okay, Senegambia, all right, in this region here. As we move further down, we move into a region called the Gold Coast, and then as we move further over into the Bight of Benin, and then we move further south into all the way down to Angola. And these are really going to be the major regions. And as we zoom in the map, you can see Sao Tome, that was a major slave outpost, okay, and a number of other places too, the Cape Verde Islands, for example. And as we move further north, okay, we get into the Canaries, okay. And so these regions are being discovered. These little islands off the coast of Africa are being discovered, and the Europeans, these were largely, a lot of them uninhabited. The Europeans start setting up colonies, or not colonies, but rather forts, okay, on these islands. The only ones that were occupied were the Canaries. They were occupied by a group of native Canarians known as Guanches, and the Spanish end up taking over these regions. But the Portuguese are really the first to come down here, and they're establishing trading post type settlements, not really the same kinds of settlements that, say, the English set up over in for permanent settlement. These are just kind of trading outpost settlements that the Portuguese are trying to establish. And remember, too, one of the big reasons that they came down here is because they were hoping that people in these regions over here had ideas about trade routes that would allow them to get over to this region, because that's really the goal. These early European explorers are trying to get to these regions here so that they can trade in spices and various other fine goods that were only available from the Far East without having to travel across land. That's another thing we should probably bring up about this as well. In our modern day times, we look at the ocean and we think of it as a great barrier, all right? The ocean, we think of, the ocean exists as this major water physical barrier that is difficult to get across unless you can afford to fly across it or whatever, all right? Europeans increasingly are, in their time, in the 14 and 1500s, looking at water as the great connector. We think of land typically as being the great connector, but really land was, in the Europeans' view, the Great Barrier. It was very, very difficult to get across land. After all, they don't have, advanced machinery, trucks, buses, whatever else, or even freeways or anything like that, to get across the land. It's very, very difficult to traverse land. The ocean, on the other hand, and rivers and various other bodies of water were viewed by Europeans as the great connector. They were kind of like God-made superhighways that you could just put a ship onto water and it would more or less be able to navigate, so long as the water was deep enough, wherever the water went. Okay, and that's really what they're hoping to find. And then the last of the three major Portuguese explorers that we're going to be looking at here is Vasco da Gama, who sailed to the Spice Islands by sailing up the coast of Africa to Malindi, and found an Arab guide to take them across the Indian Ocean to the Spice Islands. Okay, so the Portuguese capture North African city of Ceuta and begin exploring the African coast. They were originally in search of gold and spices, particularly pepper, black pepper, and cloves. It might surprise you. You probably have a salt and pepper shaker at home, or one of those fancy pepper grinders or whatever. The pepper that is in your pepper grinder would have been worth more than its weight in gold in Europe at that time. Now, of course, today pepper is very, very cheap because it's readily available and it comes from a bunch of different places. But back in those times, pepper was not readily available, but it was in high demand, which meant that the price of it was very, very high. We think, for something that we think of as so simple, that's pretty interesting. And also, people to convert Muslims and pagans to the Catholic faith. That's what they were originally in search of. But their focus very quickly shifted to African slaves, as I said. Even before Columbus, 1450 to 1500, the Portuguese had already brought about 150,000 slaves to Europe. The Portuguese focused their efforts in the Indian Ocean, all right, and that was because there was that Venetian Muslim monopoly on spices who bought them from Muslim merchants in the Ottomans. And it meant it was very difficult for people in Spain and Portugal to acquire these goods, as the Venetians had a monopoly on that trade, and that trade was dominated by the Italian states, in particular Venice. Land routes to the Far East were also particularly dangerous, difficult, and very unprofitable. It becomes the longer you have to travel, the further you have to travel, the more expensive it becomes to travel that distance. And then there's Bartholomew Diaz, who sailed around the Cape of Good Hope, and Vasco da Gama, who landed in India, as examples of some of those explorers who extended that trade. So as we look at this map here, you can see the Portuguese very early on, before Columbus, are sending ships down to these regions here, okay, all the way up over here to the west coast of India, so that they can trade, all right? And you can see here, here's the Cape of Good Hope, like I was pointing out, and then Vasco da Gama comes all the way up here and starts trading over in these regions over here for special things that they had in India that were not available in Europe: cotton, precious stones, sugar, spices, silks, perfumes, drugs, porcelain, things like that, all right? And then we eventually move to Spanish exploration. So because Spain and Portugal are closely situated to one another, the Spanish end up adopting a number of the Portuguese navigation improvements, including ship design and other things like that. And on September 9th, 1492, Columbus, after receiving permission, because remember in these days you weren't doing anything that you weren't explicitly told you could do, all right, he received permission from the King and Queen of Spain to sail across the ocean. Now, how come across the ocean? Well, going back to this map here, all right, look over here. You see the Portuguese had already laid a claim to these areas down here. If the Spanish had decided to take the same routes and start doing the same thing that the Portuguese were doing, they would have run into conflict with the Portuguese, who would have looked at this as their rightful claim to trade in these regions because they were the ones who went down there first and set up shop. So the Spanish don't want to impede on Portuguese trading posts that have been established along the coasts of Africa and now all the way over to India. So the Spanish kind of say to themselves, well, we don't want to start an unnecessary war with our neighbor Portugal. Maybe what we can do is we can find another route going the opposite direction across the ocean that will eventually meet up over here on the other side without interfering with the Portuguese settlements that had been established here and potentially causing a war. So the thing with Columbus, by the way, we don't really know what Columbus looked like. The only portraits that we have of him were done after he died. And so no one really knows exactly what he looked like. This is kind of what we have in our head of what this guy may have looked like, but we don't really know exactly what Columbus looked like. And Columbus was an experienced navigator of sorts. Okay, he's not a complete imbecile, all right, but he's also of the belief that the Ptolemaic, meaning of or related to Ptolemy, who was that guy that we talked about from ancient Greece who had calculated the circumference of the globe to about 98% accuracy. All right. Columbus was one of a minority of explorers of his time who did not believe that the Ptolemaic estimates of Earth's circumference were accurate. And he instead suggested that the Earth's circumference was actually about a third smaller than what Ptolemy had suggested initially. Now, of course, Columbus was not correct about that. He was wrong. But this was an appealing thing to the King and Queen of Spain to hear, because if the Earth was indeed, as Columbus suggested, a third smaller than it was, it would mean that it would be much easier for him to travel across the ocean to the west to be able to get to the East Indies, Japan, China, etc. All right, he doesn't realize at the very earliest, and possibly not even before he died, that the place that he did land wasn't even India, that it was this brand new continent. All right, it's not until later that it is realized by a different guy named Amerigo Vespucci. Amerigo Vespucci was a different explorer, all right, who continued to travel across the ocean and explore the new regions. And Amerigo Vespucci is the one who really came out and suggested we are dealing with an entirely new grouping of continents here, and that's why they are named the Americas, okay, is after Amerigo Vespucci. And so Amerigo Vespucci and Magellan explore South America. Remember, Magellan was the one to circumnavigate the globe first. As Spain sets their, they send Columbus with 3 ships, the Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria, and these 3 ships sail across the ocean. It takes them 33 days to land in what is now San Salvador. All right, he makes land on October 12th, okay, thereabouts. And as I said, when he first gets there, he mistakes it for arriving in India, which is how Native Americans in these regions, okay, indigenous peoples of the Americas, start to become referred to as Indians, is because early Europeans went over there and thought that they were dealing with, indigenous folks from India. And of course, they were not right about that, but nonetheless, that's how that name Indians comes around. Now, the first Native Americans that Columbus runs into are called the Taino Indians, Taino, Taino, okay, the Taino Indians, all right, Taino Native American tribe. And the Tainos are relatively friendly, okay? They provide Columbus and his men with corn, yams, and then also, too, there are some not so nice stories about Columbus and his men having, being that it was all men that went on this voyage, there were no women. And as the Europeans came into contact, in particular the Spanish came into contact with the indigenous folks, they at times sexually exploited the Native Americans, taking advantage of them, assaulting them. Other times there were less violent interactions, but the one thing that they are not finding that they had really hoped to find was gold. And, talking a little bit about the Native Americans, what we have to understand is that the Native Americans in the New World had a vast and multi-ethnic, multicultural background. It's really inaccurate as it would be to refer to Europeans as a single collective group of people, all right, because the Europeans don't identify as themselves as European, all right? They identify themselves by their local regional titles of Spain or England or wherever they're from, all right? It would be equally as inaccurate to describe Native Americans as a single group of people, right? Because the Native Americans made up thousands and thousands of different cultural groups that spoke different languages and had different customs and so on and so forth. Some of them are friendlier, others of them are more hostile. The other thing that you got to remember about the Native Americans when the Europeans arrive, okay, and I need to kind of set the stage for you a little bit so that we don't rewrite history in our heads to be something inaccurate. The common misconception, I think, in early days is that the Europeans came over and they were just so far more advanced than Native Americans were, that they just came over and overwhelmed the whole continent and displaced Europeans and displaced the Native Americans, and that Europeans put themselves in the place of Native Americans on those lands. And while the outcome of that is true, the way that this occurred is not because the Europeans' technology was just so far advanced and they just waged war everywhere and took all these places over. The real factor that enabled Europeans to come over and take over territories in the New World had more to do with disease. And we can talk a little bit about why that is later on. But really it's the disease that ravages the Native Americans, not so much the Europeans coming over and just conquering everybody with advanced weaponry or something like that. Now, it is true to an extent that the Europeans were more technologically advanced. Europeans had mastered, for example, metalworking. So they had metal weapons and other things, blades, swords, and various other weapons like that the Native Americans did not have. Europeans also had other weapons like crossbows. They had weapons like guns and stuff like that. But I really do need to caution you not to think of this as they're not showing up with like Uzis or something like that. All right, they're showing up with extremely primitive weaponry by modern day accounts. And the guns that these Europeans brought over with them, you could scarcely have hit the broadside of a barn from about 25 feet away with these weapons. They were extraordinarily inaccurate. They were also very, very slow to load. And, they're just not very good weapons by comparison to, say, like a bow and arrow. Like archers, Native American archers were every bit as threatening as a European with a gun, probably more threatening and more deadly, to be honest, because you can fire off a lot more arrows in a short period of time than you can bullets from a gun of the 14 or 1500s. Okay, so that gives you a little bit of background on Columbus. Also, the other thing we got to remember about Columbus and his interaction with the Native Americans, and actually you're going to have an assignment dealing with this today, I'm going to have you guys read and do a hippo assignment pertaining to Columbus's journal, where he interacts with Native Americans. And actually what I'm going to do here is just set the stage a little bit more for you about this really unusual interaction that we see happen between the first explorers, Spanish explorers under Columbus, and their interaction with the Taino Indians when they first arrive on the shores. A couple of things to keep in mind about this interaction. I often describe this interaction as probably one of the most amazing and bizarre and global, in terms of the global repercussions that it has, events in all of history, all of human history. I mean, imagine coming from Europe and having this entire understanding of Christianity and how the world works and the social systems that make Europe the way that it is. These guys are coming over from a solely European experience. They are meeting, for all intents and purposes, a completely foreign grouping of people that they had never interacted with before. And so the Europeans come with their customs, with their understandings, with their entire social and historical discourse, okay? Their understandings about what the world is, about what religion is, about what European practices are, and so on and so forth. And they're coming over, and they are interacting with a completely brand new group of people that, of course, they're going to have a difficult time communicating with because they don't speak the language of these indigenous people. The indigenous people also don't speak the language of the Europeans. Okay, so miscommunication is going to be a major factor in this interaction between these two people. And that might seem obvious to you. It might seem obvious that Europeans and Native Americans are going to have a difficult time, particularly in the beginning, communicating with one another. But it stands as a good point to mention to you guys because I want you to be considering that as you read Columbus's journal and the degree to which he was able to actually understand the interaction that was taking place. Another thing that we should consider, Native Americans had, by comparison to the Europeans, some things going for them that the Europeans didn't. For example, the Europeans come over, and keep in mind that Columbus and his men are these dirty, disgusting Europeans who characteristically don't bathe very frequently. Europeans live in close proximity with animals, which is how Europeans were able to develop immunities to so many diseases, okay? Because when you live amongst animals, when you have animals everywhere that you have domesticated, that you are living quite literally with, okay, either in the streets or in your home or on the farm or whatever with, you're living in very, very close proximity to animals, and animals are vulnerable to illnesses just like humans are. Eventually, some of those illnesses, every so often, jump over. They do an interspecies leap, and Europeans end up becoming sick with animal-borne illnesses, all right? And over time, the Europeans would either perish from those illnesses or a lucky group of people with the right combination of immunities would be able to survive these illnesses, fight the illnesses off, and continue to procreate. And so what happens with Europeans a lot of times is when they're young, they're exposed to disease and illness, and if they're strong enough, they survive into adulthood, but it leaves them with these horrible scarred faces from pox marks on their faces, from smallpox, and so they have these kind of scarred faces. They're rather ugly, they're rather unkempt, all right? They're coming over, they stink. Keep in mind, these guys set sail across the ocean September 9th. They land in San Salvador, which is in the Caribbean, in October. If you've ever been or know anything about the Caribbean, it's not like it's not like it's cold, all right? It's in the tropics. It's hot all year round. They're coming over after having been in the same clothes, scarcely having bathed. They're gross, and they arrive on the coast, whereas the Native Americans, on the other hand, were actually quite hygienic. All right, Native Americans, there aren't very many domestic, in terms of where animals existed in a pre-Columbus time on Earth, there are relatively few animals that were appropriate for domesticating in the New World. The only ones that we really see in the New World are going to be llamas and alpacas. And even they, of domesticatable animals, they're not the easiest ones to deal with, and really they're only located in Peru, modern-day Peru, where the Inca Empire was at the time. All right, but the idea being that Europeans come over, they're discussing. The Native Americans, on the other hand, took better care of their teeth. They bathed in the ocean regularly, and they were relatively clean. Okay, they were pretty clean people, and hygienic people. But because of their lack of interaction with animals and their close contact or lack of close contact with domesticatable species of animals, of which, if we're really counting across the whole globe, of all of the animal species out there, which is thousands and thousands of animal species, right? There's only about 13, maybe 12 or 13, that are really domesticatable, meaning like cows, pigs, goats, sheep, animals like that, camels, okay, but horses, but most of them are originating from Europe. Okay, most of those animals originate in Europe. There were no wild horses in North or South America. There were no wild pigs. There were no wild cows. All right, the Europeans brought those animals over with them, along with all of the diseases that those animals had been transferring over for centuries to Europeans back in Europe. And really, it's this animal issue and the lack of immunities to animal-borne illnesses that the Europeans had developed over a long period of time that ravages the Native American population, not a little bit. Okay, when we talk about deaths, to give you a comparison, right? If we talk about the Black Death in Europe, the Black Death in Europe in the 1340s wiped out about a third of the European population. Now that's a huge number of people. Okay, if COVID had wiped out a third of the United States population, we would have been talking about 100 million deaths or more. That would have been traumatic. It would have been horrible. Okay, and it certainly was for Europe. But when we talk about losses of Native Americans, that number 33% pales in comparison to the number of Native Americans who die at the hands of European diseases. Because when we talk about that number, we're getting to the number of about 90%. 90% of Native Americans were wiped out by illnesses within a century of Europeans arriving in the New World. Think about that for a second. 90% of the population within 100 or about 110 years or so of Europeans' arrival to the New World are wiped out by European disease. This is an extraordinarily high number. 90% is almost hard to wrap your head around. Okay, there had been millions and millions of Native Americans living across the continents, North and South America. 90% of them that the Europeans come into contact with are wiped out by various illnesses that the Europeans bring with them, particularly, though, smallpox. So, before I turn you loose to work on the assignment today, which is going to be questions from the reading guide, as well as this journal here, this excerpt from Columbus's journal, I wanted to take a minute to show you this excerpt and talk to you a little bit about how it reads. Okay, so this is the excerpt that we're going to read. It might be kind of small text on your screen, but it might be a little confusing to you when you first start reading this, because in the original part here, when we talk about this part right here, okay, all the way to about right here where it says Indies, okay, this is from somebody else introducing Columbus. This is from somebody else who was with Columbus on that day when the Europeans arrive in the New World, okay, as sent by the Spanish. Columbus and his men arrive on Friday, the 12th of October. And so this part right here, I will read for you. The vessels, meaning the ships, were hove to, waiting for daylight. And on Friday, they arrived at a small island of the Lucayos called, in the language of the Indians, Guanahani. Presently, they saw naked people. The admiral, meaning Columbus, went on shore in the armed boat, and Martin Alonso Pinzon and Vicente Yanez, his brother, who was captain of the Nina. The admiral took the royal standard meaning like a symbol from Europe demonstrating that he had been given royal permission to go and claim these lands on behalf of Spain. and the captains went with 2 banners of the green cross, which the admiral took in all the ships as a sign, with an F and a Y, an F for Ferdinand of Aragon, a Y for Isabella of Castile, and a crown over each letter, designating that Ferdinand and Isabella were king and queen of Spain, one on one side of the cross and one on the other. So I want you to already be thinking about this, because what they're doing here, the Spanish have a ceremony, okay? They have some practices. They have brought with them these symbols, okay? Excuse me. They brought with them these symbols that have a whole lot of meaning to them. The cross is extremely meaningful to the Catholic Spanish. All right, F and Y with a crown over each letter. That's obviously designating the ideas of the King and Queen of Spain. All right, and you know, the royal standard and all these other things they bring with them on shore to demonstrate where they're coming from. All right, now you have to understand from the point of view, and again, thinking back to Hippo, okay, Hippo, point of view, POV, all right, from the point of view of the Native Americans, these symbols mean precisely nothing to them. So one of the things that I always describe to students about this interaction is on one hand, it's almost like this cataclysmic meeting where these 2 different worlds, the old world of Europe and the new world of these Native American groups, they're colliding into one another. The same, like a almost, you know, very, like almost imagine like an asteroid or a comet colliding with, you know, a planet or something like that. On one hand, they're kind of crashing into one another, and we see this amazing interaction happen. But at the same time, at the very same time that they are colliding with one another, due to a complete absence of understanding one another's backgrounds, histories, cultures, religions, and various other social patterns and structures, there is zero understanding from either side, right down to language. All right, and so while they are on one hand colliding with one another, the other side of it is that they are entirely missing one another. They're almost kind of 2 ships passing in the night because of the level of miscommunication and difficulty and inability. I mean, how could we possibly expect either of these groups to really truly understand one another when they had never even known of each other's existence prior to this fateful day? Having landed, okay, so now I'm right here. Having landed, all right, they saw trees very green and much water and fruits of diverse kinds. The admiral, meaning Columbus, called to the 2 captains and to the others who leaped on shore, and to Rodrigo Escovedo, secretary of the whole fleet, and to Rodrigo Sanchez of Segovia, and said that they should bear faithful testimony, these 2 gentlemen should bear faithful testimony that he, Columbus, in presence of all, had taken, as he now took, possession of the said island for the king and for the queen, his lords, making the declarations that are required, and I'll talk about that in just a second here, making the declarations that are required, as is now largely set forth in the testimonies, which were, sorry about that, my lights went off in my room, so I had to turn it back on, which were then made in writing, these testimonies of how Columbus went about taking possession of these lands. So the Spanish have this whole ceremony. All right, now I want to focus on this little thing that would be very easy to skip over, making the declarations that are required, making the declarations that are required. That seemingly is a little innocuous statement that doesn't carry much meaning. But there was, when the Spanish went and took possession of places, they had like a statement, okay, a thing that they would read to people that they were encountering. Now keep in mind, of course, they're going to be reading this statement in a completely foreign language that the people have absolutely no idea what the words are in the first place, but even beyond that, they have no idea what the words are even referring to, all right? Even as I read this next thing to you, I think you're going to be in awe at what they were saying to these Native Americans expecting that somehow the Native Americans would make any sense of it whatsoever. All right, but before I move on, I just want to say, so this whole introduction is by somebody else, all the way down here until Indies, okay? So presently, many inhabitants of the island assembled. What follows is in the actual words of the admiral, meaning Christopher Columbus, in his book of the first navigation and discovery of the Indies. And this right here where he says, I, he says, okay, and right where it starts with I here, that is where we're now in Columbus's words. So now it's going to be from this point on Columbus speaking. I, he says, that we might form a great friendship, for I knew that they were a people who could be more easily freed and converted to our holy faith by love than by force, gave to some of them red caps and glass beads to put round their necks, and many other things of little value, which they gave them great pleasure, and made them so much our friends that it was a marvel to see. So I want you, as you read this, I want you to be thinking, okay, about can we trust Columbus here? Okay, is Columbus lying? Is he not telling the whole truth? Is he misunderstanding the communications that took place? Why is he writing this document? Who does he assume is probably going to one day read the document, you know, on the other side of the ocean? Probably the King and Queen of Spain, right? So think about, because of his audience, all right, of who's probably going to be reading this, because of his mission that he has been given, because of his status as a European explorer who has been tasked by the King and Queen of Spain to go and establish themselves in this new land that they thought at the time was in fact India, all right, which we now know is not, but in his time, again, take all of these ideas into mind when you read this. And so I want you to be reading it against the grain. Don't just take it passively and think, oh, well, he's probably telling the truth here, and we can just assume that everything that he says is 100% truthful, and that's the way that it was, okay? Don't trust what he says. Read against the grain. Be thinking to yourself, how can I question what I'm reading here and get a better understanding of why the words say what they say? I want you to be thinking about how he describes Native Americans, knowing in your heads probably that the Native Americans and the Europeans ultimately, in not too long a time, end up having very, very conflicting relationships, and there's a lot of war and conflict between these groups of people. All right, so be keeping those things in mind. But before I let you go, the last thing I want to read for you today is about this declarations that are required. And I'm going to read for you the actual declaration that the Spanish explorers, the conquistadors and others, would bring with them over to the New World, all right, when they were interacting with these groups. Let's see here. And it's called the requirement, and I'll make this available to you online as well, but I'm just going to read this for you right now. All right, this is paraphrasing essentially because it was a little longer than this, but it gives you an idea of what it says. So I'm going to read this for you. This is what they would read to Native Americans to take possession of the islands and territories that they were acquiring. Listen to how this goes. On behalf of His Majesty, the King, I, his servant, messenger, notify and make known as best I can that God our Lord, one and eternal, created heaven and earth. God our Lord gave charge of all peoples to one man named Saint Peter, so that he was Lord and superior of all of the men of the world, and gave him all the world for his lordship and jurisdiction. One of these pontiffs, popes, one of these pontiffs made a donation of these islands and mainland of the ocean sea to the Catholic kings of Spain. Almost all who have been notified of this have received His Majesty and obeyed and serve him as subjects, and turned Christian without reward or stipulation. And His Majesty received them as subjects and vassals. Vassals are people who are lower than you on the social hierarchy in Europe. Therefore, I beg and require you, which is why this is known as the requirement, Therefore, I beg and require you as best I can that you recognize the Church as Lord and superior of the universal world, and the most elevated Pope in its name, and His Majesty in his place as superior and lord and king, and consent that these religious fathers declare and preach, and his majesty and I in his name will receive you, and will leave your women and children free without servitude, so that with them and with yourselves you can freely do what you wish, and we will not compel you to turn Christians. But if you do not do it, with the help of God I will enter forcefully against you, and I will make war everywhere and however I can, and I will subject you to the yoke and obedience of the church and his majesty, and I will take your wives and children, and I will make them slaves, and I will take your goods, and I will do to you all the evil and damages that a lord may do to vassals who do not obey or receive him. And I solemnly declare that the deaths and damages received from such will be your fault, and not that of his majesty, nor mine, nor of the gentlemen who came with me. So I want you to consider that, okay? Consider that requirement. And if you didn't notice at the end, there's a pretty distinct tonal shift there from the more kind wording of the beginning of the document and the extremely threatening wording of the later portion of that document. So between those two documents, which I will make available to you, I'm going to ask you that you take that into consideration when you do a hippo and answer some questions about Columbus's journal and his initial interaction with the Native Americans there. All right, so that brings us, oh, and by the way, this is a map of what's known as the Columbian Exchange. This is after Columbus, Europeans from the Old World bring over a bunch of things to what becomes known as the New World. All right. Likewise, there's a number of things that are brought over from the New World all the way back over to Europe. And this map, this visual aid here, helps give you an idea of some of the things that Europeans brought over with them from the Old World to the New World. One of which, of course, is going to be sugar. That's a very important one. A lot of people think that sugar was a New World product, but it actually was brought from the Old World over to the New World because they discovered very quickly that sugar would be easier to cultivate in the Caribbean. It's very, very difficult to cultivate sugar anywhere in Europe aside from a couple of coastal places in the Mediterranean that have climates that are warm enough to support sugar growth. But the territories over here that's possible are very, very limited. There were far more territories over in the Caribbean and other places that sugar grew prosperously. All right. Meanwhile, from North America, they brought corn, maize, okay, potatoes, tobacco, squash, peppers, cocoa, also syphilis of venereal diseases. Syphilis was one that was originated in the New World. But they bring over with them smallpox and countless other diseases that ravage the Native Americans' populations over here. Also, keep in mind some of the things that we think of as European foods, like tomatoes in Italy or potatoes in Ireland or something like that. These are not at all Old World products. They didn't become associated with those regions until they were brought over from the New World to the Old World, and they realized, hey, tomatoes grow really well in Italy. Potatoes grow really well in Ireland. Okay, those kinds of things. All right, so many of our modern day understandings of where foods originated are actually kind of backwards from where they came from back in the old days. All right, and this is the Columbian Exchange, the transfer of goods between Old and New Worlds after Columbus's initial arrival. All right, folks, well, that brings us to the end of the lecture for today, and we will be picking this up on Wednesday. So I'll be posting the reading guide assignment. I'll be posting the hippo assignment. Please do get those done by Wednesday and have those submitted. If you were one of the people who missed the test, please get that done by 6 p.m. today so that I can get those into the grade book as soon as possible. And that brings us to the end of the class today. Folks, have a great rest of the day. Happy Monday.